As the West continues to sanction Russia for its illegal invasion of Ukraine, some foreign companies have stepped into the frame and are supplying the Russian military with critical technologies prohibited by the EU, US and UK. The EU's special envoy for sanctions, David O'Sullivan, has been travelling to third countries with the aim of limiting sanction circumvention. David O'Sullivan is my guest on Global Conversation. David O'Sullivan, EU sanctions envoy, thank you very much for joining us on Euronews.
Thank you.
So your job is sanctions envoy, but I suppose really what you're trying to do is ensure that sanctions potential is maximised so that other countries around the world or private entities are not undercutting the sanctions deployed by the US, the EU and the UK. Tell us a little bit about your role.
Well, that's exactly what we're trying to do. We have an unprecedented range of sanctions against Russia, more than we've ever sanctioned any other country. We have 60% of our imports, previous imports from Russia are under sanction, 55% of our exports. And obviously, ensuring effective implementation is very important. And one part of that, which is my responsibility, is to reach out to countries who have not aligned with our sanctions.
So what would you say then would be a successful use of your time? And I mean, this time next year, would you hope to see that these critical goods, this critical infrastructure, isn't found on the battlefield in Ukraine?
Well, we are already seeing that it's getting more difficult for Russia to acquire these things. I think we have to be realistic. There's always going to be a degree of circumvention. There's money to be made. A lot of these products have all previously been sold to other countries and are kind of out there on the free market. So if somebody wants to try and buy them, they are still available. But I think our main objective, and in this I think we are succeeding, is to make it harder, to make it slower, and to make it more expensive for Russia to access these products.
Are you worried, though, that Russia will just reorient its economy completely and be able to take all of these exports from huge countries like China?
Well, the thing to remember is that the point about these products, and most of them, maybe for your viewers we should explain, I mean, they are typically semiconductors, integrated circuits, fiber optical readers, flash memory cards. I mean, they're things that have a perfectly innocent civilian application in normal circumstances, but also they are largely made with US or EU technology. They are not easily replicated in other countries. So it is hard for Russia to get them as we cease to export them and as we persuade countries, intermediary countries, no longer to re-export them to Russia. And I think, yes, we do see some evidence that it's getting much more difficult, and they are using substitute products, sometimes of Chinese origin, but which are inferior quality, to be frank. So this is giving the Ukrainian military a certain technological advantage on the battlefield.
Has things changed for you or maybe become more difficult since the heinous terrorist attack by Hamas on October 7th? Because we saw criticisms from the likes of King Abdullah of Jordan, for example, who was concerned that the EU's position when it came to international humanitarian law, protecting civilians in Palestine, wasn't the same concern when it comes to civilians in Ukraine.
I think they understand that for the Europeans this is a different situation. I mean, Russia has attacked Ukraine without any provocation. Ukraine posed absolutely no threat to Russia. So this is an unprovoked, full-scale invasion of a sovereign country. And I think people understand why, for us in Europe, we have to push back very strongly, and Mr. Putin's ambitions of re-establishing Russian hegemony in the immediate neighborhood of Russia is something we cannot accept. So I think people do understand it's different, and that is why, as Europeans, we have a particular obligation in this situation. Of course, I would argue we have also taken a firm position in relation to what's happening in the Middle East. But of course, I don't sense that people see this as a sort of binary choice. I often explain we can manage more than one crisis at a time.
Well, we hear from some member states that say that these are pointless and they're just impacting the European economy. So, citizens are suffering at a time when there's a cost of living crisis, and yet the Russian economy is growing, albeit much slower, 1.1%, I think the IMF said. So what do you say to that response that, well, this is pointless and Europeans are just suffering?
Well, it does come at some cost to us, let's be honest, because we traditionally have traded a lot with Russia. It's still not a major part of our trading pattern, and I think companies have been able to find alternate markets. In terms of the effectiveness, I mean, honestly, we had three objectives. One was to deprive the Russian military of the technology. The second was to deprive the Russian government of the revenue. And the third was to impose a high cost on the military-industrial complex. Across all three of those objectives, I think we have had quite a lot of success. We are seeing Russia is struggling to get hold of the technology it needs. They're now turning to Iran or North Korea. And we do see evidence that the Russians are having to roll out older weapons, older tanks, in order to keep their military equipped. On the revenue side, we estimate that the Russians probably have about 400 billion euros less to spend. The Russian government traditionally had a surplus in their public expenditure. They're now running a deficit of 2 to 3%. Yes, the Russian economy is growing a bit, but you need to look closely at why that's the case. It's because they're massively investing in their military. 30% of Russian public expenditure is now on the military, nearly 10% of GDP. If you put your economy on a war footing, of course you can bend everything to the interests of military, but you're cannibalizing the economy. There's no investment going into social welfare, into education, into health, into research. So the prognosis for the Russian economy, and that's the third objective of reducing their industrial capacity, the prognosis is not good.
India is buying a lot of Russian oil, refining it, sending it back to the West. That seems a bit kind of counterproductive. What is your position on that, and how much of a loophole that seems to be?
Well, we decided at the very beginning that we would not do an embargo on the export of Russian oil in the way that we did, for example, with Iran. The reason for that was because many parts of the global south were dependent on the continuing to allow Russian oil to flow, and we took the position that we would allow those flows to continue. So it is perfectly legal for other countries. We're no longer buying Russian oil, but it's perfectly legal for other countries to buy it.
And sell it back to the West.
And we have capped the price at which it can normally be purchased in a way that it still undermines the revenue that Russia gets. And our estimate is that in the first half of this year, revenue from oil went down by 50% in Russia. But yes, they are still able to export it. And yes, in some cases, like India, they refine it and send it back to us. The Indian argument would be that they're the ones making the profit, not the Russians. And I think the main objective from us is to make sure that the Russian revenue is severely impacted by the oil price cap. And I think we see a lot of evidence that that is the case.
OK, David O'Sullivan, EU sanctions envoy, thank you very much for joining us on Global Conversation.
Thank you.